The rain was a steady drum that morning, like someone practicing a hymn on the roof. I could taste the coffee I'd had at home, bitter and warm, in the back of my throat as I climbed the 3 steps to the First Baptist. The umbrella felt slick under my fingers, the navy fabric crinkling, a familiar weight I had carried every Sunday for decades. My cardigan was damp at the cuffs. The air smelled of wet pavement and something floral, Margaret's lavender, I guessed, like a ghost arriving before her. He was huddled against the church's side wall, shoulders curled in, head bowed under a hood that had seen better winters. Up close I could smell rain and the faint sour note of old fabric. His hair was streaked with gray. His hands, when he lifted them to cup his face, were cracked and darkened. I'd seen him around town before, sometimes on Main, sometimes near the post office. We all had a kind of practiced invisibility for people like him. Except that morning I stopped. "Tome," I said, holding the umbrella so he could take it. The Portuguese slipped out of habit with my neighbors, but he understood. He looked up slow, like someone unaccustomed to being offered anything without a price. His eyes met mine, brown, steady, a little tired, and for a second the rain seemed to soften around us. "God sees beyond appearances, ma'am," he said. His voice was clear. His teeth, when he smiled, were even. He accepted the umbrella with a reverence that made the gesture feel holy. The fabric made that small dry crackling sound as he closed it and tucked it under his arm. I remember the way my palms felt afterward. Damp, warm, slightly numb from the cold. I remember walking inside with water tracing down my sleeves and leaving a dark trail on the floor. Margaret caught my eye in the foyer. Her face tightened into the shape of disapproval. "Vivian, dear, you're dripping on the carpet," she murmured, like the carpet mattered more than the man outside. She wore her welcome brooch glittering against a pastel blazer. The perfume was almost too sweet. Pastor Simmons waved from the pulpit area. A small, distracted wave. He was at his best that morning in a way I've come to recognize as staged comfort. The practiced smile, the hand smoothing a tie that never seems to sit right. He had that habit of adjusting it again and again when he was thinking. The service blurred around me. Hymns practiced 1,000 times, the organ breathing its slow chords, but my mind kept landing on the man by the wall. There was a hollow place in my chest I thought was just age, until I realized it was shame. Shame for how quick we all were to look away. Shame that my small action had felt like an exception in a room full of people who say the Lord's Prayer every Sunday. That week I went about my routines the way my bones have always preferred. Tuesday Bible study, Thursday food pantry, Sunday service. I shelled peas in the fellowship hall, my fingers remembering the rhythm. I folded plastic bags and tried not to notice how Margaret rearranged the donation table like a stage set. The umbrella stayed in the corner by my coat rack at home, navy and slightly bent from the way he had tucked it under his arm. The following Sunday the sky was bright as if it had cleared off our sins. I walked the same 3 blocks, the sidewalk smelling fresh, my umbrella folded and safe. The church doors opened and a ripple of whispers reached me before I took my seat, like a storm of words had passed through while I was gone. The front pews were fuller than usual. Faces turned towards the aisle with a curiosity that felt almost electric. When Pastor Simmons announced the guest preacher, my stomach dropped. The man from the rain stood now at the pulpit, clean-shaven, hair combed back, a suit that fit him like he'd been born into it. He carried a Bible that looked loved. Its leather worn smooth by hands I imagined had been calloused by life. He scanned the congregation slowly, as if measuring every breath. Then he pointed, right at me. My hands found the carved oak of the pew and dug in. My knuckles went white. I could hear my pulse in my ears, a steady thump that matched the organ's sustaining note. The room exhaled into a silence you could almost touch. "This lady," he said, his voice steady. "She covered me in the rain." He smiled in a way that folded the whole sanctuary in. It was not accusation. It was invitation. He lifted something navy from beside the pulpit, my umbrella, and the sight of it made my chest tighten further, like someone had wrapped a hand around my heart. Eyes moved past me, searching faces for judgment, for applause, for the script they expected to find. Margaret's perfume seemed to spike, her lips a tight line. Pastor Simmons' hands went to his tie, the familiar twitch. I felt exposed in the most intimate way, as if a single thread had been pulled and my whole knitting came apart. He didn't say much else then. The rest of his opening was gentle, almost a benediction. But when he said that he had been watching our congregation to decide whether to accept the invitation to serve here, something shifted. The gesture I'd made had been small, private, and suddenly it was a mirror held up to all of us. As people leaned forward, some with tears, some with surprise, I sat very still. The umbrella was still in his hands, navy against the pulpit's dark wood, and for a moment it felt like the only object that mattered. The small, stubborn proof that kindness is sometimes the loudest sermon of all. The rain was a steady drum that morning, like someone practicing a hymn on the roof. I could taste the coffee I'd had at home, bitter and warm, in the back of my throat as I climbed the 3 steps to the First Baptist. My loves, thank you for giving me a little of your precious time. This channel is just beginning, and every new subscriber is a breath of life for us as we reach toward our first 1,000. If this story touches you, please click subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I love knowing where you're sitting with me. The mornings at my house have a rhythm that feels like prayer, whether I mean it to or not. I woke before the sun, as I always had, to the quiet scrape of the kettle and the soft, reliable click of the old coffee maker. The smell rose through the kitchen like memory, bitter, dark, the way my mother used to make it when she was still alive. Light from the east slid through the thin curtain over the sink, making the water spots on the window look like little stained glass pieces. The 68 routine is my scaffold. I dress the same way I have for decades. Sensible skirt, cardigan, low-heeled shoes. I fold my hair back with one practice motion. There is comfort in the predictability of small things. A warm cup cupped in both hands, the way the collar of my cardigan sometimes catches the back of my neck, the soft ache in my knees when I climb the 3 steps to the church. These are the markers of a life lived in the same town, in the same pews, under the same steeple. My faith has a face here that I know by sight. I can tell the people I love by the sound of their coughs and the way they cross themselves. I've been a member of First Baptist for nearly 40 years. I sang in the choir when my voice still rang clear. Now I help at the food pantry and serve on the hospitality team. I fold plastic grocery bags on Thursday afternoons like a prayer folded into itself. The church is not just a building. It is a map of my life, the altar where my brother's name was read aloud in memoriam, the stained hymnals worn soft by generations, the brass collection plate that catches the light during offertory and always seems a little too bright. On that rainy week, the church smelled like damp wool and the faint, ever-present lavender that followed Margaret Wells like a shadow. Margaret's perfume announces her at the door before you even see the welcome brooch pinned to her lapel. She takes pride in the foyer, the arrangement of chairs, the freshness of the bulletin, and she tells anyone who will listen that presentation is part of welcoming. She means well in her way. But sometimes presentation becomes a curtain that hides things. The sanctuary has its own small details that I think about even when I try not to. The altar cloth has a deep blue embroidery. Someone at the church once said blue is the color of mercy. I suppose that's why I always notice it. A small wooden cross sits to the left, plain and scuffed from years of hands touching it. The organ bench has a faint burn mark on its edge where years ago a votive candle fell. There is always one pew that stays empty near the front, an empty place for a visiting elder, or a family who needs privacy. That empty space has, for as long as I can remember, felt like an invitation and a warning at once. I can still hear the little bell over the church door in my head. Even on ordinary mornings it has a way of cutting through everything, a bright metallic peal that says, "Come in." Bells are gentle commands. They remind you of belonging. That morning the bell was. I had seen the man who stood against the church wall before. Sometimes a face becomes part of the traffic of small-town life. A shadow you notice when you pass, then forget until the next time. He was one of those faces. I had watched him shuffle near the post office, once sitting on the bench by Johnson's Market, once beneath the overhang outside the library. I assumed necessity explained everything. That morning, the rain made other people disappear into their hoods and hurried strides. It made me notice him, though, the way someone notices a small crack in a window they've always assumed was solid. My hands were still smelling of coffee when I opened the umbrella. The navy fabric felt familiar under my fingers, slightly slick from the rain, the metal ribs giving it a tremble. I remember the small sound when I snapped it open. A dry, decisive pop that seemed louder than it should have been. I did not intend to make a sermon that day. I only intended to help a man keep from getting soaked. And yet, even before the pulpit lifted a voice to speak, the church had its little signs of theater. Margaret smoothing the welcome tablecloth, Pastor Simmons adjusting his tie for the 100th time, the front pews a little more vacant than they had been that spring. Those small sights, once joined with a navy umbrella in a stranger's hands, would later feel like stitches pulled from a hem, revealing more than they concealed. As I took the umbrella off the hook and felt the cool of the metal, a thought I could not name came with it. A house of faith, I realized, is made of people. And people are messy and beautiful and sometimes ashamed. I would carry that thought into the sanctuary without knowing exactly how it would come to ask us all to look at ourselves. The moment his finger found me, something in the room rearranged itself. It was like someone had lifted the roof and let a shaft of cold air fall straight through my chest. The organ held a single long note, and every other sound, coughs, the rustle of hymn pages, even the soft scrape of shoes, fell away. I could feel my heart, loud and stubborn, stamping time against my ribs. My hands went to the pew in front of me without thinking. The carved oak was smooth and slightly tacky beneath my palms. My fingers tightened until the joints ached. My knuckles went white. I could feel the warmth of the wood seeping into the pads of my hands, steadying me like a small wooden prayer. Reverend Bennett's voice was clear as a bell, calm and steady. This lady covered me in the rain. Those words landed like a verdict and a benediction at once. Heads turned. Eyes slid across the sanctuary like water over stones. I felt them, curious, pitying, judging, settle on me, and I tasted iron at the back of my tongue. The room smelled suddenly sharper. Candle wax, the faint metallic tang of the hymnals, and under it Margaret's lavender, as if she were clutching at propriety. Pastor Simmons stood off to the side, his shoulders a little too high, his hands pressed to his tie the way I'd watched him do for years whenever he felt pulled tight. He looked like a man holding a paper cup of his own making, thin and uncertain. For a beat I thought he might step forward and explain, say, it was meant as an example, or we were trying to help, and undo everything. But his mouth tightened and he didn't move. He adjusted his tie again, that same nervous little crease between his brows. The gesture felt like a confession. Heat rose to my face. My throat closed around a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Breathing became a series of quick, surprised intakes, as if the air had more gravity than usual. I could feel the damp under my cardigan at the cuffs where the rain had trickled through earlier. My hands were cold now, the kind of cold that travels down into the bones. I pressed my thumbs into my palms to stop them trembling. It occurred to me in a flash, not an accusation but an awful precise understanding, that this had been arranged. Not in the way of a kindness offered and accepted, but staged. A man invited, a congregation observed. Reverend Bennett had said he was watching, and Pastor Simmons' furtive movements confirmed it. That thought lit a smaller, sharper fire under the larger shock. I felt unexpectedly exposed, like the seam of my life had been pulled taut until someone could see the stitches. A dozen scenarios marched through my head at once. I could stand. I could speak up and say, this was private, or ask why the church had been used like a social experiment. I could refuse the applause I was sure would come, insist that kindness is not a spectacle. The chest felt tight with choice. My legs hummed under me, the old ache in my knees a counterpoint to the tension in my throat. For a breath I imagined the faces around me splitting open with truth, Margaret's carefully applied smile cracking, Pastor Simmons' practiced calm showing the strain beneath. But then the Reverend smiled, and it wasn't triumphant or accusing. There was no flourish in his thanks, only a quietness, as if he were trying to make room rather than fill it. He lifted my umbrella, and for a second the navy fabric caught the light and seemed to belong to both of us. The gesture was simple and ordinary. It was also the fulcrum that left me with a decision I did not expect to have to make in a public pew. I chose silence. I chose to let the moment stand as it was. Not because I agreed with being put on display, but because the truth of what had happened, my small act of covering a stranger in the rain, was its own kind of witness. Maybe I thought there was value in not unpicking the whole thing right then and there. Maybe calling out the setup would become another kind of performance, another chance for people to circle the wagons. My breath came out slow. I let the silence wrap around me, heavy and holy, and I felt something else settle in my chest that was steadier than shock. Resolve. I would not be a pawn in a sermon, but I would not let the opportunity for people to see themselves pass by either. I would speak later to Pastor Simmons privately. I would ask why he thought it necessary to test us in that way, to set a man up as a mirror without telling him. I would ask him what lesson he hoped to teach, and whether a lesson is worth the cost of someone's dignity. For the remainder of the opening hymn I sat very still. The organ breathed under the words and my hands loosened their grip on the pew. People leaned forward. Some had tears, some had expressions that looked like relief, like guilt, like praise. Margaret's perfume seemed louder now, a small rebellion against the damp truth in the room. Pastor Simmons' fingers moved to his tie one more time, and in that brief motion I saw the man I'd known for decades, imperfect, scared, and trying to hold an image of goodness together. When the benediction came, Reverend Bennett's eyes met mine again. There was nothing more to say in public. I felt the umbrella's shadow on my lap as if it were a seal. I rose slowly when the congregation stood, the oak pressing back against the heels of my hands where I had gripped it. The decision I had made, to remain silent and tend the private reckoning later, felt weighty and right in a way I couldn't fully explain. Outside, the air was fresh and clean like a promise. Inside, the church still hummed with the aftershock of a small moment that had unfolded into something larger than any of us had planned. The pew felt warmer than the air around me, like a pocket of old prayers. People drifted forward in small knots, murmuring. Some touched my shoulder with a quick, wet-fingered condolence. Others hovered as if afraid I might crack. Margaret was the first to find me. Her hand landed on my elbow with that practiced, perfumed pressure. "Vivian, what a surprising way to help," she said, smile fixed, voice edged with something like relief. Her eyes skimmed me and then slid away. Her lavender caught in my face. Too sharp, like an apology that doesn't know how to sound sincere. I felt my hands tremble and tucked them into my cardigan pockets. "It was raining," I said. Came out small. She leaned in as if confiding a secret. "We all want to be compassionate, of course. There's a way to do these things, dear." Her words were a glass door closing. Later in the fellowship hall, plates clinked. Coffee steamed in paper cups. The conversation had the brittle thinness of post-performance. People repeated phrases they'd heard from the pulpit. "We must see the Christ in everyone," as if repeating would make it true. The Reverend found me before the crowd thinned. Reverend Bennett's suit was still crisp. Up close, his hands were large and sure. He held my umbrella in one hand like something precious he had borrowed and wanted to return whole. "Mrs. Clark," he said. He didn't smile the way Margaret did. His face was calm, almost gentle. "May I sit?" I nodded and we moved to a corner table. The cafeteria lights hummed low. and the smell of coffee and lemon cake filled the air. He inclined his head. I believe truth revealed itself best when people were given a mirror. I hoped to hold one up. The umbrella made a small creak as he shifted. But you, he said quietly, chose compassion without thinking about being seen. That is rarer than we like to admit. He spoke like a man explaining a mystery. I wanted to be grateful. His words were flattering. But I also felt the prick of violation. Dignity, I thought. Had anyone asked the man if he wanted to be part of someone's lesson? You invited him? I asked. He paused, then nodded. Pastor Simmons contacted me. He thought bringing someone with a broader experience might perhaps stir the congregation. The name landed like a stone. I had watched that man adjust his tie, the habitual fidget that spoke of nerves and control. I pictured him orchestrating a scene to shake awake a flock he loved but feared was complacent. You made him. I stopped. The hall felt louder suddenly. Voices rose and fell like surf. He did not complain, Reverend Bennett said, and there was no triumph in his voice. He came and he agreed. He understood what it might mean. The words did not settle like answers. They were small practical facts that did little to cover the feeling I had of being displayed. After a moment he reached across and covered my hand with his. His skin was warm. I am sorry you felt exposed, he said. That was never the aim. I almost laughed. And yet it was the result. He didn't argue. He sat back and let the silence stretch like a stretched him. Outside someone laughed too loudly. Inside the room Margaret rearranged the cookie tray, her jaw tight. I walked to Pastor Simmons' office later that afternoon. The hallway smelled of old books and lemon oil. His door was slightly ajar. I knocked, and he motioned me in with a hand that still trembled when he adjusted his tie. He was smaller off the pulpit. In the office he was just a man with a stack of bulletins and a dish towel he'd used to wipe his hands. He looked at me as if waiting for me to perform the anger he might have expected. Vivian, he said, I'm glad you're here. I need you to understand. You arranged this? My voice was quiet but held a weight. He sighed, and Saturday I invited Reverend Bennett. We thought. He stopped and smoothed a folded program, fingers worrying the edge. We thought it might be a wake-up call. I worried we were becoming too comfortable. I thought a demonstration would. Sometimes people learn better when confronted. You thought you should use a man's life as a demonstration? The words felt sharp enough to hurt. My palms were numb. I rubbed them together. His eyes dropped. We asked for his consent. He knew the context. Consent, I repeated. The syllable tasted like coal. Even so, the way it was public. You turned a private act into a sermon. You made me the example. He looked older then, not from age but from the sudden raw awareness that he had misjudged the line between teaching and spectacle. I didn't think of it that way, he said. I thought. You thought it would help, I finished. The words were softer. But you didn't think of how it would make a person feel, or what it would do to someone's dignity to be the lesson without being asked. He stared at his hands. The tie lay like a defeated snake across his lap. I wanted the church to remember its heart. And did it? The question was a knife turned gently. He blinked. I hope so. Outside, the bell above the door chimed as someone left. The sound felt ordinary and sharp all at once. I left the office with my umbrella hooked over my arm. The sky was clear, as if nothing had happened. But inside me something had shifted. Questions clustered like rain clouds refused to leave. What is faith when measured by applause? What is kindness when it becomes a lesson? The congregation would speak of the sermon for weeks. They would pat themselves on the back. They would say they were reminded. But the memory I held, of a man accepting a navy umbrella with reverence, of Reverend Bennett's steady voice, of Pastor Simmons' nervous hands, would not let me slide back into the comfortable rhythm. That night, I set the umbrella by the door and ran my fingers along the fabric. The ribs made a faint, remembered creak. I'd been put on display, yes. But the act itself, the choice to offer shelter to someone in the rain, remained mine. And in that small ownership was a promise. I would not let anyone turn dignity into a lesson again without asking whose story it belonged to. After that afternoon in the pastor's office, I thought the worst of it might be over. I thought the uneasy quiet would settle back into the comfortable rhythm I knew. I was wrong. The first sign came small and domestic. The woman who delivers our church bulletin each Thursday used to knock on my door to wait for the postman. She'd chat about her grandchildren, the garden, the price of gas. The week after the sermon, she left the bundle on the stoop and walked away without looking up. I stood on the porch with my umbrella hooked over my arm and watched her go. The sound of her shoes on the pavement was a little too loud in the sudden empty air. Inside the grocery store, the clerk who always helped me to my car with the bagging smiled at me, then turned his head as if someone had called his name. His laugh stopped before it reached his face. At the post office, the woman who'd known my name for years slid my package across the counter like a thing she was discarding. "Have a nice day," she said, and the words were tinny hollow. Everything became a small rebuke. At church, the change felt surgical. It began with glances that arrived late, as if people had to work up the nerve to look my way and were ashamed of doing so. Then the whispers started, low like the shuffle of hymn pages. They weren't loud enough to be rude, but loud enough to be noticed. A chair scraped back in the fellowship hall and the conversation moved across me, as if I were a fireplace that had been banked for winter. Margaret was the first to do it outright. One Sunday she crossed the lobby, her brooch catching the light, and pretended she didn't recognize me until she was almost past. Her hand hovered over the welcome table as though to adjust the brochure, and then she let go. "We're so glad for all who show compassion," she said to the circle she'd joined, not to me, and the laugh that followed looked practiced. The lavender perfume she wore filled the foyer like an apology offered in a paper cup. Pastor Simmons stopped seeking my eye. He would stand where he always stood before the benediction, hands near his tie, and when the congregation sang he would look at the ceiling in the way of a man rehearsing the lines he'd say later. Once, when I went to his office to ask about organizing another food drive, his voice was tight. He offered me platitudes about learning moments and engaging the congregation, while his fingers found his tie and tugged until the fabric left a crease in his palm. I left the office with my instructions written on a folding piece of paper, mechanical and personal, and felt the warm spot on my chest where conversation used to sit. People I'd known for decades began to find reasons not to sit near me. The front pews filled with polite distance. A family who used to keep a seat open for me now chose the opposite aisle. It was subtle at first, a gap, a turned face, but the gaps grew until there were whole rows where my name once belonged. Children, who had once run over to hand me hymnals, were quietly shepherded away by parents who offered a quick, nervous smile and pulled little hands back. A boy I'd helped with Sunday school last year looked at me as if I were a stranger whose handwriting he couldn't read. Even the smallest tasks turned into gauntlets. I went to volunteer at the food pantry on a Thursday and found the crates rearranged. Someone had moved my apron to the back of the closet. "We'll call if we need you," said a woman I'd worked beside for years. Her eyes slid away. The words landed like a dismissal. I walked home with bags that felt suddenly heavier. Whispers followed me into church more sharply than anywhere else. People who had touched my hand in sympathy now touched theirs to their chests as if to hold something in. I could hear snippets of sentences. Staged, test, we didn't know. The parts of the story people chose to tell themselves to feel better. There was also the softer thread of admiration, the ones who nodded as if to applaud secret courage. Those faces were fewer, and their nods were quick and private, like a lit candle blown out before anyone else could see. Reverend Bennett's presence complicated things. He was greeted warmly, as a man who had come to help a sleeping congregation wake up. He was asked to coffee, every slight collected like rain in a gutter, until it became a small flood of isolation. I began to time my errands to avoid fellowship hour, to walk a little earlier to the post office, to sit on a bench at the park where the pigeons didn't judge me. My umbrella felt heavier, as if the navy fabric held not just wet but the weight of other people's discomfort. At night I would lay my hand on it and remember the man's eyes in the rain, steady, grateful, and the quiet way he had accepted a small mercy. I thought of the scripture we recited as children, to love your neighbor as yourself, and it felt for the moment like a line from a play that no one was quite sure how to perform. The community had learned something, yes. They had been shaken. But the shaking had toppled me into a silence I had not asked for. So I learned to carry the silence like a coat. I walked with my shoulders squared, palms pressed into familiar pockets. I answered calls with brief politeness and wrote checks with hands that did not tremble. But the isolation tightened every day. A slow band around the places where I expected fellowship to sit. It was a different kind of sermon, this one preached in the margins. And in that quiet, a new resolve formed, not loud, not theatrical, but steady. If the congregation would not hold its mirror up cleanly, I would speak to the people who could, the ones who made decisions in rooms with closed doors, and the ones who wore their perfume like armor in the foyer. I would ask for dignity to be returned where it had been borrowed for a sermon. I would ask for conversation that did not begin with an experiment. I would ask, gently and firmly, that we learn to shelter one another without making a spectacle of mercy. The moment his finger finds me, the sanctuary rearranges itself. The organ holds a long, thin note and everything else falls away. Coughs, the rustle of hymn pages, the soft scuff of shoes. Sound compresses into that single sustained vibration, and Reverend Bennett's voice rides it like a bell. It is low and certain, but when it lands on my name it shakes the air between us. This lady covered me in the rain. His words are calm, precise, and they echo up off the rafters. I can feel the echo on the back of my teeth. For a second the syllables hang bright and exposed, like a coin set on the altar. My hands find the carved oak of the pew without thinking. I wrap my fingers together, tight practical motion. Knuckles blanch. I press my thumbs into my palms to stop the tremor. Breathe, I tell myself. In, out. Slow. The breath wants to speed. I keep it small, measured, as if I could hold my whole life inside that rhythm. The smell in the room is different now, wood polish and candle wax. The faint lemon of the fellowship hall drifting through the vents. Margaret's lavender is suddenly sharper. A perfume cut through with the metallic taste of nerves. Pastor Simmons stands just off to the side, fingers moving to his tie like someone checking the seam of a familiar habit. He looks smaller than the pulpit makes him, a man trying to hold a shape together by tugging at fabric. Reverend Bennett lifts something navy by the pulpit, my umbrella. The fabric flashes in the light, and the sight of it is a physical pang. The umbrella feels stolen back into the room like a testimony. I can hear the cloth make that dry, small sound when it flicks open slightly. My throat tightens. People lean forward. I see faces I have known for decades turn with that complicated, hungry expression, seeking permission to feel, to judge, to forgive. Some eyes are kind. Some are calculating whether this will make a good story at the next coffee hour. The air tastes like anticipation and lemon cake. Then small, accidental, impossible to ignore. A candle on the altar gutters. The flame lurches as if something moved through the room and then snuffs with a quiet, final puff. The wax smoke curls and the light in that corner dies. A soft murmur runs like a draft around the pews. The extinguished flame feels like punctuation. A hush deepens. A floorboard creaks by the side door. An almost theatrical sound like an opening of a new scene. Someone shifts. A child coughs and holds it in. The sanctuary's volume moves in waves, but Reverend Bennett continues, his voice steady, the cadence of a man who has practiced telling the truth slowly enough that people can catch it. Then a small wooden cross, nailed to the back wall near the pulpit, gives a little shudder. Maybe it was a contraction of the wood, or a clip loosened when someone bumped the lectern, but it slides, tips, and for a sick instant hangs horizontal before it falls. It hits the floor with a soft hollow clack that seems impossibly loud. Heads turn toward the sound like iron filings to a magnet. The clack is a smack in the quiet, a physical punctuation marking the moment. My chest tightens around that sound. I feel the cold of the oak under my palms. My breathing is small and contained. An effortful thing, like trying to hold a hand over a candle without letting it go. I count my breaths in my head, not aloud. 3. I need to keep my face composed. My mouth tastes of metal and the instant more ancient than the pews. Reverend Bennett's eyes find mine again. There's no accusation in them, only an odd, intense gratitude that makes me uncomfortable in the marrow. She gave me shelter, he says, and the words fold the room back toward some imagined decency. The umbrella between us is both a prop and a witness. I can see the grain of the pulpit wood under his palm. The smell of old varnish rises like memory. Pastor Simmons' fingers tremble on his tie. Margaret's smile has hardened into something that could be carved. Somewhere in the pews someone exhales loudly enough to break the focus, and the sound spreads like a spiderweb. The crucifix lay on the floor now, face up where the light picks the grain of the wood. Its fall is small, accidental, but it reads like an omen. My options roll through me like an inner sermon. Stand and protest. Speak and demand explanation. Walk out. The congregation waits like an audience holding its breath, hungry for direction. My heart pounds loud, immodest against my ribs. My fingers clamp down until the wood presses into the soft pad beneath them. I choose to keep my hands folded. I choose the slow, tight breath. I choose silence. Not because I am resigned, but because the moment is complicated. The man on the pulpit is not only a test but a witness. The pastor who invited him is not only brave but clumsy in his zeal. To unravel all this here would be to exchange one spectacle for another. I let the silence hang, heavy like a hymn held long at the end. The sanctuary breathes with me. The fallen cross waits where it fell. The candle's smoke curls up into the dim. Outside, beyond the stained glass, life continues. Mailboxes, porches, the indifferent sky. Inside, something has broken open. When the hymn resumes, the organ is softer. People sing, but the melody holds a new edge. I sit very still, thumbs pressed into my palms, feeling the echo of the Reverend's voice and the clack of the cross in the hollow of my bones. I know with a clarity that feels like a vow, that whatever comes next, I will not let this moment be the only mirror we hold up. The room has revealed us. Now we must answer for what it shows. The Sunday came with a hush I could feel in my bones. Word had slipped through the pews all week. Reverend Bennett was returning to finish what he'd started. My hands shook at the hymn book as if the paper could be a talisman. I'd told myself I would say nothing in the sanctuary. I'd planned to ask for a private meeting with Pastor Simmons, to speak in a room with a door that closed. But when the church bell pealed that morning, a different kind of courage settled in me. I went because I wanted to see what would happen when a whole room had to look back at itself. He stood at the pulpit again, suit pressed, Bible at his side. He did not waste words on fanfare. He said the things we expect. Scripture, a call to love, a reminder that faith is shown in deeds. Then he stopped. He folded his hands like a man folding a cloth and looked straight at me for the briefest moment, and then at the congregation. "There's one more thing," he said. The organ softened like a breath held. He told a short story about rain. He told it simply, no flash, and then he did something I hadn't anticipated. He walked down from the pulpit and stood at the front pew, with my navy umbrella leaning against the lectern beside him. He asked for a moment of honesty. Then he introduced the man from the wall. He walked up the center aisle with a gait that had an odd dignity, Not the practiced gait of a polished preacher, but the steady, careful steps of someone used to keeping himself in the world. He was dressed plainly, not in the suit he'd worn the week before, but in clothes that fit. He looked at me then and his eyes were steady. "Mrs. Clark gave me shelter because she saw me as a person," he said. "That was my choice to accept. But the display that followed asked things of her and of me that felt like theater. I wanted the congregation to see what I see. That compassion is ordinary and not a stage. I wanted them to remember to ask, to include, to respect." His voice did something to the room. Margaret's throat made a small sound. Pastor Simmons' fingers found his tie and did not tug. Reverend Bennett stepped forward and placed his palm on the man's shoulder. A quiet gesture of solidarity. Then Reverend Bennett said something I had not expected. He apologized publicly, not for bringing the lesson, but for failing to protect the humanity of the man who had agreed to help him. He apologized to me for making my private choice a public spectacle, and he asked the church to join him in making amends. Pastor Simmons stood slowly. I read resignation in the way his shoulders unrolled, as if the weight he had been holding was too heavy to keep hunched. He bowed his head and spoke with a voice I had not heard from him before, small, sincere. He said he had misjudged. He said he had thought a demonstration might rouse us, but he had not thought enough about the person at the center of it. He asked forgiveness. He offered concrete steps. A council to review how the church engaged people in outreach, a commitment to secure clear consent in anything involving members or guests, and a new hospitality team training. He paused, looking at me by me if I would accept. Silence folded and then broke like a tide. Some people sniffled. A few cheeks were wet. Margaret's perfume seemed to loosen at the edges. She reached for my hand and it took me a beat to register it. It was the smallest of gestures, perfumed and fumbling, but it was toward repair. I had imagined many endings for that week of my life. A fight, a retreat, a cold indifference. I had not imagined this public, imperfect apology. It felt messy and human and necessary. The man who read the letter set down his paper and looked at us again. "Let us not make worship into theater," he said. "Let us make it into service." When the benediction came, it was soft. People did not rush out. For the first time in what felt like weeks, the fellowship hall did not feel like a theater wing where actors practiced their bows. The coffee cups were passed with less haste. Margaret poured and did not pretend not to notice me. Pastor Simmons came over later, hands empty, and we spoke in the small honesty of two people who have been given a hard lesson. He did not excuse himself. He listened. I did not agree to chair the training out of vanity. I agreed because the thing that had started with a navy umbrella had to land somewhere that would keep people's dignity from being borrowed again. I agreed because I had seen what it did when we forgot how to ask permission, and I wanted to make space where asking was the habit. Walking home that afternoon, the umbrella hooked over my arm. The light was thin and honest. The town looked the same, but I felt the air differently, less like a stage and more like a field you had to tend. I had been put under a spotlight and I had chosen to step out, not into silence but into something quieter. A decision to keep teaching, to insist that faith reveal itself in the small, private mercies we give one another, not in the applause that sometimes follows. The umbrella is still navy. When I open it now, it makes that same small, decisive pop. I think of a man who chose to be seen and a congregation that finally was asked to see itself. And I am peculiarly at peace. The church felt different that morning, but not in the loud way change sometimes announces itself. It was smaller, sharper, like someone had opened a window and let the air in. I pushed the heavy door and the bell over it gave that bright, familiar peal. It sounded the same, bright and honest, but when it settled there was an echo I could not name. I walked down the aisle and my shoes scuffed the worn carpet in a rhythm I had known for 40 years. The sunlight through the stained glass slanted in strips of blue and gold across the pews. Dust motes spun in that light, lazy as prayers. The front pew where people had once left a space for visiting elders held only one small cushion now. It was neatly placed, as if someone had set it there on purpose and then stepped back. I sat, and the wood felt familiar beneath my hands. The oak was still warm from winter sun. My umbrella leaned against the seat in front of me, navy and folded. When I touch the fabric, my fingers remember the small pop it makes when it opens. That sound, so ordinary, still carries the memory of a rainy morning and a man who accepted a small mercy. People drifted in slowly. There were faces that had looked away the months after the sermon and faces who had come forward to ask forgiveness. Margaret arrived, her perfume softer now, somehow less like a herald and more like a bruise healed. She smiled in a way that reached her eyes. Her brooch flashed briefly, and then she tucked her hand into the hymnal as if steadying herself. Pastor Simmons sat in the pastor's chair near the lectern, his tie resting at last the way a man lets a garment be. He looked older in the creases around his mouth, but his voice when he spoke in greeting was steady. There was no performative flourish today. I could tell he had learned, not from a pulpit, but from sleepless nights and a penitent conscience. Reverend Bennett was in the third pew, quiet, a man who had done the hard work of confession and then stepped back. He nodded to me. A small, almost private thing. The man who had stood in the center of that week's storm sat a few seats away, hands folded, present and not used. He did not wear martyrdom like a cloak. He wore his life like a quiet thing that asked only to be seen. The service was shorter than usual. The hymns rose gentle and the organ breathed like someone easing into conversation. We did not applaud anything that morning. There was no need. Actions had been made, apologies had been spoken, and a small list of practical things had been written down. Consent as policy, outreach reworked, hospitality training scheduled and carried out. I had agreed to help lead that training, not to be lauded, but to make sure the thing that hurt would not be repeated in someone else's name. After the benediction, people lingered. Coffee in the fellowship hall steamed in paper cups, and there were new name tags on the table that read simply, "Ask first. Respect always." They looked small and ordinary and they felt like a line drawn in the sand. Conversations were softer. When someone touched my shoulder, it was with a hand that meant to steady, not to distance. I walked out into the bright afternoon and the town smelled of cut grass and something sweet from Mrs. Kinney's bakery down the street. My steps were measured, the umbrella hooked over my arm. On the steps outside the church a child ran past, chasing a dog, and for a moment I watched a small life go by that had not yet been made complicated by adult theater. The sight made something in my chest loosen. I passed the side wall where the man had crouched in the rain months before. The brick was warm and dry. A single patch of darker mortar marked where water had once gathered. There was no plaque, no announcement. You could stand there and miss it if you were not looking. I stopped. I did not expect anything to be carved in granite. It was enough that the place existed, ordinary and unadorned, like most acts of mercy. The wind came up as I rose and it caught the church door behind me. It swung inside and then closed with a soft, final click. The sound was not dramatic. It was precise, like a punctuation at the end of a sentence. I heard my own footsteps recede on the sidewalk, small steady beats. They softened, then faded, and the town took up its normal sounds. A lawnmower, a woman calling to a child, the distant peal of a bicycle bell. I thought of how easily lives can be rearranged by a gesture. How a navy umbrella could be both shelter and symbol. How a single act of kindness can be lifted and displayed until it becomes someone else's sermon. I thought, too, of how dignity can be returned if we are willing to ask for it and to listen when it is given back. There are mornings now when I open my umbrella simply because it still rains in this town. The pop of the fabric under my hands is a small music. I walk the same 3 blocks and sometimes as I pass the market or the post office, I see that man. Not on the bench, not hidden, but standing with a shopping bag, a coat buttoned up, eyes steadier than I remember. We nod. There is no sermon in our nods. There is only the quiet acknowledgement of two lives that touched. On the church steps, a wooden bench sits empty most afternoons. Someone left a hymn book on it once, a folded bulletin the next. The weeks after that Sunday felt like walking through a house after a party. Things were put back, but you could still see where people had stood. Conversations slowed. People learned to ask instead of assume. I kept my hands busy folding aprons and sorting cans at the pantry, letting the familiar rhythm of work steady me. There was a newness in the way people moved around one another, less performance sometimes, and sometimes only the pretense of it. Change, I learned, doesn't arrive all at once. Seeps. I agreed to lead the hospitality training because someone had to teach the language that had been lost. Ask first. Respect always. Those words sat on a laminated card on the table that first night, small and blunt, plain as a church bulletin. We practiced phrases that felt awkward at first. May I? Would you be comfortable? And watched volunteers stumble through them like children learning new courtesy. I showed them how to get real consent. Look people in the eye, lower your voice so it's not a performance, offer choices instead of explanations. We practiced listening the way we used to pray, slowly, with both hands unclenched. Reverend Bennett came back twice to lead a session on humility. How to be the person who apologizes without making it about himself. Pastor Simmons sat through every meeting, hands sometimes folded, sometimes tugging the edge of his tie as if he were still learning how to be present instead of impressive. Margaret signed up for the crafts table and spilled 2 pitchers of lemonade before she stopped herself and asked if someone else wanted to pour. She still wears lavender but softer now, like a note remembered instead of announced. The man from the wall, his name is Jonah, has a grin that's easier now, the kind that doesn't hide anything. He comes by the food pantry on Tuesdays and sometimes sits on the bench by the side wall to read the paper. He doesn't live under the overhang anymore. He sleeps in a place with a lock and sometimes a kettle that whistles. He told me once, as we folded peanut butter jars into boxes, that the umbrella had felt like charity until someone returned his name to him. You made me human, he said. He said it like a benediction, and I listened like it was a verse I'd forgotten. People apologize awkwardly and then try to mean it. Some kept their distance longer than I thought they would. But others came close, hands reaching out for mine in that careful new way. There were small restitutions. A pie brought without questions, a note left on my doorstep by a neighbor who wrote simply, "I'm sorry I didn't look." These are not dramatic repairs. No grand gestures, no chorus, but they're stitches and they hold. I still carry the navy umbrella. It's bent in the same place where the frame yielded that day. And when the wind catches it, the fabric sings the small pop that was the beginning of everything. Sometimes when I fold it closed and hook it under my arm, I think about the weight of it, not just the metal and the fabric, but the memory it holds. It reminds me how easy it is to make someone a sermon, and how sacred a single quiet act can be. The town itself keeps its old rhythms. The bakery still opens at dawn, the mail still thumps against stoops, and children still ride bikes too fast for the sidewalks. Yet there's a different pace at coffee hour now. People listen in shorter sentences and longer pauses. We speak more often of boundaries, what to do when an outreach effort involves someone's life. How to ensure dignity isn't collateral in the pursuit of a message. It's practical work, messy and slow, and at times infuriating. But it is steady, and steadiness is a kind of grace. Sometimes I find myself back at the sidewall where Jonah had crouched months ago. The brick is warm in the sun and nothing dramatic marks the place. No plaque. No sermonized memory. Just a patch of mortar darker than the rest, where the rain used to collect. I stand there for a moment and tuck my fingers into the crook of the umbrella handle. I tell myself the truth I want to keep. That justice is quieter than spectacle and kinder than shame. People still ask me in clipped, wary voices, whether I regret that I was singled out. My answer is never simple. I do not like being at the center of anything that feels engineered. I do not enjoy being a mirror people point at when they want to see themselves. But I am grateful that something about that small choice forced the congregation to look. There is a difference between being made an example and being shown a way to change. We have not arrived, but direction matters. At night, long after the fellowship hall lamps are off, I sometimes sit in the living room with the umbrella leaned against the chair and think about how many small mercies are given without notice. A neighbor who shovels a walk, a caller who checks in, a hand offered without strings. Those acts count for more than any sermon I've heard. They are private, easily overlooked, and when they are combined they reshape a community. I have learned to say no when I need to and to say yes when it matters. I have learned to ask the hard questions behind closed doors and to insist that people be asked before their stories are used to make a point. I have learned that repentance is not a one-time speech from a pulpit but a daily practice. A trimming away of the parts of ourselves that want applause for being kind. When I open the umbrella now, I think of Jonah, of Margaret's softer laugh, of Pastor Simmons' quiet evenings of reflection, of the small training cards that say ask first. I think of the bench by the wall and the child who runs past with the dog. I think of rain, how it can reveal the places we shelter and the places we leave bare. The last thing I want anyone to remember is this. Mercy is a quiet thing we give without asking for an audience. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.